When the last embers faded, the Pacific lay silent, a graveyard of steel and ashes. The war moved on, but the memory of the flame tanks never left those who had witnessed them. They were machines built for victory, yet they left behind only ghosts. In the jungles they scorched and the caves they silenced, the echoes of screams still lingered in the wind. History would remember them as tools of triumph, but the soldiers remembered something else, the smell of burning earth, the sound of men's souls crying out. Because sometimes, victory doesn't shine, it burns. By 1944, the Pacific had become a nightmare of endless jungles, hidden caves, and soldiers who refused to surrender. The war between Japan and the United States had turned into a brutal contest of endurance, each island soaked in blood, each battle more desperate than the last. The Japanese Imperial Army had perfected the art of defense, building underground tunnels and bunkers that seemed impossible to breach. Conventional weapons barely scratched them. American soldiers fought inch by inch, losing countless men to machine gun nests buried deep in volcanic rock. But then, the U.S. military introduced a new kind of terror, the flame tank. It was not designed merely to destroy, but to erase. Its purpose was psychological as much as physical, to burn the enemy out of hiding, to shatter their will before their bodies. When these steel monsters rolled into battle, entire cave systems turned into firestorms. The air filled with screams and smoke. For those who witnessed it, friend or foe, it felt less like war and more like the end of the world. The Pacific would never be the same again, because America had unleashed a weapon that turned the battlefield into hell itself. The Pacific War was unlike any other front in history. It wasn't fought in open plains or European cities, it was fought in jungles so thick that sunlight barely reached the ground. The air was wet, heavy, and filled with the buzzing of insects. Every tree, every rock, could hide an enemy. American Marines who landed on islands like Saipan, Peleliu, and Iwo Jima entered what many would later call a living hell. For the Japanese soldiers, these islands were sacred ground. Each man had sworn to die before surrendering. They dug themselves into the earth, building intricate networks of tunnels, caves, and hidden bunkers. Deep inside volcanic rock, they slept, ate, and waited, surrounded by the smell of oil, gunpowder, and damp soil. Their commanders told them that death was honor, that retreat was shame. So they prepared to die in silence, with rifles in their hands and grenades at their sides. To the Americans above ground, the jungle seemed haunted. They could hear whispers, footsteps, and sudden bursts of gunfire that came from nowhere. Days passed without seeing a single enemy face, yet the losses kept rising. Machine gun fire erupted from the ground itself, then vanished again into the darkness. The enemy was everywhere, and nowhere. Artillery shells and airstrikes had little effect. The Japanese positions were too well fortified, too deeply buried. Soldiers began to realize that brute force alone would not win this war. Each cave they approached felt like opening the mouth of a beast, dark, deep, and waiting to swallow them whole. Grenades were thrown into openings, flamethrower teams tried to clear paths, but the resistance was relentless. The heat, disease, and exhaustion were constant companions. Bodies decomposed quickly in the humidity, and the stench of death became part of the air they breathed. Marines often slept in mud and rain, clutching their weapons in case of sudden ambushes at night. Fear was no longer a momentary feeling, it was a condition of survival. Letters sent home told half the story. Soldiers wrote about courage and duty, but not about the nightmares that visited them when they closed their eyes. They didn't speak of comrades who vanished into cave openings and never returned. They didn't describe the eyes staring at them from the darkness, or the eerie silence that followed every firefight. By mid-1944, American commanders faced a grim truth: if they were to take the Pacific Islands, they would need a weapon that could do what bullets and bombs could not: smoke out the invisible enemy. Something that could reach where no soldier dared to go. Something that could make even the most fanatical defender think twice before standing his ground. And so, From the blacksmiths of war came an invention forged not from steel alone, but from fear itself, a weapon that would make the ground burn and the air scream. A weapon that would change everything, the flame tank. The idea began in silence, deep within the U.S. military's Pacific Command. Conventional tanks had struggled in the thick jungles and rocky terrain, where narrow trails and hidden bunkers made movement nearly impossible. The enemy wasn't standing in open battlefields, they were buried in caves, impervious to bullets and explosions. America needed something that could reach inside the earth itself. Engineers looked at the existing M3 and M4 Sherman tanks and imagined something more terrifying. They called it the flame tank. Instead of firing shells, it would breathe streams of liquid fire. A thick, sticky fuel, napalm, would be pumped through a pressurized nozzle and ignited, sending burning jets up to 150 feet away. What made it horrifying wasn't just the flame, but how it behaved. Napalm clung to everything it touched: walls, rock, flesh. Water couldn't extinguish it. The fire would crawl, seep, and devour until nothing was left but smoke and ash. Early prototypes were tested in Hawaii. Observers stood frozen as they watched the tanks turn concrete bunkers into molten craters. The fire roared with a sound that felt alive, like the breath of some monstrous creature. One Marine later wrote, "It wasn't a weapon. It was a dragon on tracks." By 1944, the new weapon had a name, M3 Satan, soon followed by the M4 Sherman Zippo. They were born from necessity but shaped by the cold logic of war. Their mission was not only to destroy but to terrify. When Japanese soldiers learned of the new tanks, rumors spread faster than official reports. They called them Hell Machines. Each tank carried 2 men, a driver and a flame operator. Both understood what they carried was unlike anything used before. Even among American troops, the sight of those tanks inspired awe and unease. Some whispered that no man should have the power to summon such fire. Others saw them as angels of survival, machines that could finally end the nightmare of cave warfare. The tanks moved slowly, their engines roaring like beasts, their armor gleaming under the Pacific sun. When the nozzle turned toward an enemy bunker, time seemed to stop. Then came a thunderous hiss, followed by a river of flame. It struck like a whip of fire, wrapping around trees, earth, and stone. The jungle itself screamed. For the Americans watching, it was a grim satisfaction. For the Japanese, hidden in their underground shelters, it was the beginning of a new kind of terror. The air outside turned orange, the heat suffocating, the oxygen vanishing in seconds. Word of these flame tanks spread through the islands before they ever arrived in full numbers. Soldiers began to fear what was coming. Not bullets, not bombs, but something alive, something ancient, something that brought man's worst nightmare to the battlefield, the power of fire itself. The first real test of America's flame tanks came on the island of Saipan in mid-1944. The Japanese had fortified it into a death trap, a maze of caves, tunnels, and underground chambers dug deep into volcanic rock. For weeks, U.S. Marines had been pinned down by snipers they could not see and machine guns that seemed to rise from the ground itself. Every step forward came at the cost of blood. Then, one humid afternoon, a strange rumble rolled through the jungle. The sound was different, lower, heavier, and oddly rhythmic. The Japanese defenders peered from their hidden slits, expecting another Sherman tank. What they saw instead froze them in disbelief. The tank stopped just short of a cave mouth, and the front nozzle began to rise slowly, like the head of a cobra preparing to strike. There was a moment of silence. Then the world turned to fire. A jet of flame shot out, twisting like a living serpent, its roar drowning out everything else. The firestorm raced into the cave, sucking out the air and turning the inside into an oven. Smoke poured out, thick and black, carrying with it the smell of burning oil and charred earth. Those inside had no chance to react. Even if the flames didn't reach them, the heat alone boiled the oxygen from the air. Within seconds, life itself was gone. American soldiers standing nearby watched in stunned silence. They had seen artillery, bombs, grenades, but nothing like this. One Marine later recalled, "You could feel the heat on your skin even from 100 feet away." The cave screamed back at us. It wasn't just burning, it was alive. As the tank moved forward, the same scene repeated again and again. Bunker after bunker erupted in sheets of flame. The Japanese tried to fight back, but their bullets bounced off the thick armor. Grenades were useless. The tanks rolled closer, relentless, like iron beasts breathing destruction. The psychological effect was immediate. Survivors from nearby caves tried to flee, breaking one of the most sacred codes of the Imperial Army: never surrender. Men who had sworn to die began to run, their discipline shattered by fire. Even officers who shouted commands found their voices lost in the roar. The Americans advanced, cautiously at first, realizing they had found a weapon that could turn the tide. They used flame tanks to flush out strongholds that had held for weeks. Where once entire platoons had fallen trying to take a single cave, now a burst of fire ended the fight in seconds. That night, as the jungle glowed faintly from the embers, the Marines looked at the horizon, orange streaks flickering against the dark sky. One soldier whispered, "If hell exists, we've just seen what it looks like." It was the beginning of a new chapter in the Pacific War, one written not in bullets or blood, but in fire. War has always carried fear, but nothing in the Pacific could compare to the terror unleashed by the flame tanks. Once the Japanese soldiers realized what these machines could do, their morale began to unravel in ways the Americans had never seen before. The fire didn't just kill, it erased. It left no trace of uniforms, no weapons to recover, no graves to honor. For a culture that believed in dying with dignity and facing death bravely, this was humiliation beyond imagination. Survivors who escaped the infernos described the horror in trembling voices. They spoke of comrades turning into shadows within seconds, of walls melting, of screams that never faded. Some Japanese officers wrote in their diaries that the flame tanks were demons sent by the enemy to consume the soul of the warrior. Soldiers began to fear the sound of distant engines long before the tanks even appeared. The mere rumor that flame tanks were approaching was enough to cause panic, forcing entire units to retreat from their positions. But the fear was not one-sided. The American soldiers who operated these tanks carried a heavy burden of their own. They knew what they were doing was beyond the normal boundaries of warfare. One Marine operator recalled years later, "We didn't feel proud after using it. We felt haunted." You don't forget what fire does to a man. Still, the weapon's effectiveness was undeniable. Before the flame tanks, capturing a Japanese-held cave could cost dozens of lives. Now, a single burst of fire accomplished the same in seconds. The cold arithmetic of war favored efficiency over emotion. The commanders saw results, and soon, flame tanks became standard in major Pacific operations. In battle reports, U.S. officers noted how the weapon didn't just eliminate enemies, it broke their spirit. Japanese soldiers known for suicidal charges and fanatical resistance began surrendering in numbers previously unseen. For an army trained to never yield, that change spoke volumes. Fire stripped them of the one thing they valued most: control over their own death. In the dense jungles of Guam and the volcanic slopes of Iwo Jima, soldiers would sometimes find caves filled with charred remains still clutching weapons, proof of how fiercely they fought and how completely they were consumed. The smell of burned earth lingered for days, marking each battlefield as a graveyard without names. American troops learned to use this fear tactically. They would announce flame tanks over loudspeakers before advancing, knowing panic would do half the work. For the Japanese trapped underground, every flicker of light, every shift in the wind, became a sign of approaching doom. War had always been about courage and strength, but this was something different. This was psychological collapse on a scale unseen in modern combat. The flame tanks didn't just destroy bodies, they burned through the spirit of the Pacific War itself. By late 1944, the tide of war in the Pacific had begun to shift. The introduction of the flame tank was not the only reason for America's growing dominance, but it became one of the most feared symbols of that change. Each island captured brought U.S. forces closer to Japan's home territory, and with every battle, the flame tanks played a decisive role in breaking the stalemates that had cost thousands of lives. On Guam, the Japanese had dug into coral ridges and dense forests, creating layers of defensive positions that seemed impenetrable. American artillery pounded the island for days, but the defenders refused to yield. When the first M4 Sherman flame tanks rolled ashore, they changed the equation instantly. Caves that had survived countless bombardments now erupted in seconds under waves of liquid fire. Entire sections of the jungle burned with an orange glow visible for miles. Marines advancing behind the tanks described it as watching hell clear a path. Soon after, the same scenes unfolded across Tinian and Okinawa. Each time, the Japanese tried new tactics, mines, suicide attacks, hidden traps, but none could stop the advancing infernos. The tanks moved slowly, but relentlessly. Their armor shrugged off small arms fire, and their nozzles unleashed burning jets that crawled along trenches and into hidden tunnels. The defenders were trapped between fire and steel, their courage tested beyond human limits. The Americans began coordinating infantry assaults with the flame tanks, turning them into instruments of precision terror. The tanks would first cleanse the battlefield of fortified positions, then the Marines would move in to secure what remained. The efficiency was devastating. In a matter of months, strongholds that had resisted for weeks fell within days. But victory came at a moral cost. Some American soldiers struggled with what they witnessed. There were moments when the enemy tried to surrender, only to be caught in flames because communication was impossible inside the chaos. Others remembered the smell, the sickening mix of fuel, ash, and burned earth that clung to their uniforms long after the battle ended. Still, the psychological advantage was undeniable. The Japanese High Command began reporting declining morale across the Pacific Islands. Even the most disciplined units showed signs of despair. Flame tanks had done what artillery and bombers could not, they shattered the will to fight. By the time the U.S. reached Iwo Jima, the Japanese defenses were stronger than ever, but so were the Americans' tactics. The combination of overwhelming firepower, mechanized innovation, and psychological warfare turned what should have been suicide missions into strategic victories. For the first time, the balance of fear had shifted. The empire that once seemed unstoppable now faced an enemy that fought with both fire and fury. The Pacific War was no longer just about territory, it had become a battle for the human soul. And in that battle, America's flame tanks had proven to be more than machines. They were the embodiment of a turning tide, cold steel powered by relentless fire. When the flames died and the silence returned, the soldiers were left to face a truth far darker than the smoke that hung above the battlefield. Victory, they realized, had come at a terrible cost, not only to the enemy but to their own humanity. The flame tanks had done what they were built to do. They broke the Japanese defense, saved American lives, and helped win the war. But for those who operated them, the memory of what that fire consumed never truly faded. In the aftermath of each battle, Marines would walk among the ruins. The once green jungles had turned black, the earth scarred with ash and molten stone. The caves that once echoed with battle cries now breathed only silence. Sometimes they found weapons still clutched in skeletal hands, sometimes only shadows burned into the rock. There was no glory in those sights, only the haunting question of whether such destruction could ever be justified. Some American tank operators confessed that they avoided looking directly at the flames as they fired. Others wrote in letters home that they couldn't bring themselves to describe what they'd seen. "We stopped thinking of them as men," one veteran said decades later. "We had to, or we couldn't have kept fighting." Historians would later debate whether the use of flamethrowers crossed the moral line of warfare. To many, it was a necessary evil, the only way to root out an enemy who refused to surrender. To others, it was a glimpse into the abyss of what humanity becomes when victory matters more than mercy. The Pacific Campaign had forced both sides to abandon illusions of honor. In a war fought to the death, compassion had no place. Yet even among the Japanese, there were voices of reflection. Captured soldiers spoke of their fear not with hatred, but with disbelief. "We were taught that fire was purification," one survivor said. But in those moments, it felt like punishment from the heavens. For them, the flame tanks were not just weapons, they were symbols of divine retribution, as if the gods themselves had turned against them. When the war finally ended in 1945, and the soldiers returned home, many left their stories untold. The flame tanks were quietly retired, replaced by newer machines, but their legend endured, whispered among veterans, studied by historians, and remembered by those who had seen the fire firsthand. In the end, the Pacific War was not just a contest of armies or nations. It was a confrontation between technology and humanity, between invention and conscience. The fire had won the war, but it had also burned something deeper, a scar on the soul of every man who watched the world turn to flame and realized that, in war, even victory can look a lot like damnation. When the last embers faded, the Pacific lay silent, a graveyard of steel and ashes. The war moved on, but the memory of the flame tanks never left those who had witnessed them. They were machines built for victory, yet they left behind only ghosts. In the jungles they scorched and the caves they silenced, the echoes of screams still lingered in the wind. History would remember them as tools of triumph, but the soldiers remembered something else, the smell of burning earth, the sound of men's souls crying out. Because sometimes, victory doesn't shine, it burns.